The Fritzl Case, the Family and Hidden Darkness. A quiet Austrian town, Amstetten, Austria, sits about 70 miles west of Vienna. By the late 20th century, it was known as a peaceful, middle-class community, the kind of place where nothing truly extraordinary ever happened. Life in Amstetten was defined by routine, tidy homes, familiar faces, and a sense of safety. That's what made the revelation in 2008 so shocking. For decades, one of the most horrifying crimes of the modern era was unfolding in silence, hidden beneath an ordinary suburban home. From the outside, the Fritzl family looked unremarkable. Their house stood on Ibstrasse, a somewhat dated but sturdy building with a large cellar. Josef Fritzl, the patriarch, was well known in the town, a retired engineer, a landlord who owned multiple properties, and someone who commanded respect if not warmth. Neighbors described him as strict, arrogant, and somewhat intimidating, but nobody could have guessed what he was capable of. Josef Fritzl's early life. Josef Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935 in Austria. His childhood was shaped by World War II and the turmoil of post-war Europe. His father abandoned the family when Josef was young, leaving him to be raised largely by his mother. Those who knew him later described him as intelligent but cold, with a manipulative streak that only grew stronger as he aged. As a young man, Fritzl trained as an engineer and eventually built a career in construction and property development. His intelligence and technical skills were undeniable, but beneath this respectable exterior lay darker impulses. By his own later admission, Josef had been aware of his deviant desires since his youth. He fantasized about domination, control, and imprisonment, ideas that would eventually form the foundation of his crimes. In public, he kept these urges hidden, constructing instead the image of a hardworking family man. Marriage to Rosemary. In 1956, at age 21, Josef married Rosemary, a woman 5 years younger than him. At first glance, their marriage appeared typical. She was quiet, submissive, and dedicated to family life, while he was domineering and controlling. Together, they had 7 children, one of whom was Elisabeth Fritzl, born in 1966. But beneath the surface, the marriage was marked by fear and manipulation. Josef held absolute authority in the household. He expected obedience and used intimidation to enforce it. Rosemary rarely questioned him, and the children grew up under his stern and sometimes frightening presence. Josef's criminal past. Josef Fritzl was not a stranger to crime. In 1967, he was convicted of rape and attempted rape. He had attacked a 24-year-old nurse and was sentenced to prison. He also reportedly engaged in acts of voyeurism and sexual harassment against women in the neighborhood. Despite these red flags, he reintegrated into society after serving his sentence. Astonishingly, he faced few long-term consequences. The incident faded into obscurity, and Josef resumed life as though nothing had happened. This history of violence should have been a warning, but at the time, Austria's system did little to track offenders once they completed their sentences. Josef returned to his family, his dark impulses unchecked. Elisabeth Fritzl's early life. Elisabeth, the fourth of Josef and Rosemary's children, was described as a shy, sweet girl with striking features. But her childhood was overshadowed by her father's controlling behavior. Josef demanded obedience and often disciplined the children harshly. Elisabeth, in particular, felt the brunt of his dominance. By her teenage years, Elisabeth began to rebel. She longed for freedom, a life beyond the suffocating walls of her home. At 15, she even attempted to run away, briefly escaping to Vienna. Police quickly found her and returned her to Josef, who promised authorities he would look after her. To outsiders, this seemed like the act of a concerned father. In reality, it was part of Josef's tightening grip. The house with a secret. During the late 1970s, Josef began designing extensive modifications to the family home in Amstetten. He told officials and neighbors that he wanted a large basement for storage and a workshop. Over time, he expanded it, creating a labyrinth of hidden rooms. These renovations went largely unnoticed. After all, Joseph was known as a capable engineer, and it wasn't unusual for him to tinker with building projects. But Joseph wasn't simply building a basement, he was constructing a prison. By the early 1980s, he had created a hidden section of the cellar accessible through a series of locked doors. Behind one door was another, and then another, each with heavy steel reinforcements. The final chamber could only be opened with an electronic code, one known exclusively to Joseph. Inside, he built a small apartment, a cramped, windowless space with low ceilings, soundproof walls, and rudimentary facilities. To anyone else, it might have looked like an elaborate bunker. To Joseph, it was the fulfillment of a long-held fantasy. Elisabeth's growing vulnerability. As Elisabeth reached adulthood, she longed to escape her father's shadow. At 18, she began training to be a waitress and expressed interest in moving away. Joseph, however, could not tolerate losing control over her. He viewed Elisabeth not as a daughter but as property. In his twisted mind, she was the one who would satisfy his lifelong fantasies of domination. Throughout 1983 and early 1984, Joseph worked obsessively on the basement's hidden chambers, preparing them for what he had already decided. Elisabeth would never truly leave. Foreshadowing the horror. By the time Elisabeth turned 18, Joseph had perfected the lie he would use to explain her disappearance. He told his wife and neighbors that Elisabeth was troubled, that she had run away before, and that she was talking about joining a cult. When the time came, he would produce a letter in her handwriting, claiming she had gone to live elsewhere voluntarily. No one in the family suspected what Joseph was planning. Rosemary, who lived under her husband's dominance, never questioned his motives. The children accepted their father's sternness as normal, and the community, seeing Joseph as a strict but respectable man, had no reason to imagine the dungeon hidden beneath his home. The stage is set. By the spring of 1984, Elisabeth Fritzl was 18 years old and dreaming of independence. She had spoken about moving in with a friend and starting a new chapter of her life. To her, the world outside her father's home was full of possibilities. To Joseph, those dreams were a threat to his control. He was ready, the basement was finished, his plan was in place. Soon, Elisabeth would vanish, not into the arms of a cult, as Joseph would claim, but into the cold, suffocating darkness of the cellar he had built for her. The stage was set for a crime that would shock the entire world. A crime that would remain hidden for 24 years, the disappearance of Elisabeth Fritzl. The night of April 28, 1984. It was a quiet Saturday in Amstetten. Josef Fritzl told his wife, Rosemary, that Elisabeth had agreed to help him carry a door into the basement. To Rosemary, it was nothing unusual. Joseph often involved himself in building projects. She thought little of it as her daughter accompanied him down the cellar steps. But what Elisabeth didn't know was that this was no ordinary task. The door she was helping to carry was actually the final piece of her prison, the last barrier Joseph would seal to trap her inside forever. Once she stepped into the chamber, Joseph locked the mechanism behind her. The sound of the door closing marked the beginning of her captivity. For Elisabeth, confusion quickly turned to terror. She begged her father to let her out, but Joseph was unmoved. He had planned this for years, and now his fantasy had become reality. The lie. Hours later, Joseph appeared upstairs and told his wife that Elisabeth had run away. He said she wanted freedom, that she had spoken about joining a sect, and that she had left willingly. Days later, he produced a letter in Elisabeth's handwriting, a letter he had forced her to write before her imprisonment. In the letter, Elisabeth pleaded with her family not to search for her. She insisted she was safe, that she had chosen a new life away from them. The words were convincing enough for police to accept, at least initially. After all, Elisabeth had run away once before. To them, this story seemed plausible. Rosemary was devastated but believed her husband. To the outside world, Elisabeth had disappeared, another troubled young woman who had gone astray. But beneath their very feet, she was locked in darkness. Life in the cellar. The hidden basement was small, damp, and suffocating. Elisabeth's world now consisted of bare walls, low ceilings, and artificial light that Josef controlled at will. There were no windows, no fresh air, no escape. In the early months, Josef visited her daily, bringing food, water, and supplies. He also began the systematic abuse that would define her imprisonment. Elisabeth was subjected to his domination, stripped of freedom, dignity, and hope. She cried, pleaded, and even screamed in the beginning, but the soundproof walls swallowed her voice. Nobody could hear her. Josef's double life. Upstairs, Josef maintained the facade of a normal life. He continued working as an engineer, managing his properties and interacting with neighbors. To them, he seemed strict but ordinary, a man who enjoyed gardening, tinkering with projects, and keeping order in his household. Rosemary, meanwhile, raised the remaining 6 children, grieving for Elisabeth but slowly accepting her absence. Over the years, Josef manipulated everyone into believing his version of events. His control over his family was near absolute. At night, while the world slept, Josef descended into the cellar to exert control over Elisabeth. The first pregnancy. In 1986, 2 years into her captivity, Elisabeth discovered she was pregnant. For most young women, this would have been a moment of mixed emotions, fear and hope intertwined. But for Elisabeth, it was a nightmare. She was trapped underground with no medical care, no support, and no possibility of escape. Josef dismissed her fears coldly. He provided her with basic supplies and insisted she keep the pregnancy secret. The confined space, lack of fresh air, and minimal resources made every day a struggle. In the summer of 1986, Elisabeth miscarried her first child. Alone, in pain, and terrified, she endured the experience without any medical assistance. Josef later admitted to police that he burned the remains of the miscarried baby in the furnace. Elisabeth's endurance. Despite the trauma, Elisabeth fought to stay alive. She knew that if she gave up, her father would win completely. She clung to fragments of hope, the idea that someday, somehow, someone might discover the truth. To survive, she adapted. She organized the tiny space, kept herself busy with whatever Josef allowed her, and tried to hold on to her sense of self. But the isolation was crushing. The days blurred into weeks, the weeks into months, and soon, years had passed with no rescue. The outside world moves on. Meanwhile, the Fritzl family upstairs carried on. The younger children grew up, went to school, and slowly adjusted to life without their sister. Neighbors occasionally asked about Elisabeth, but Josef always had answers. He told some she had joined a sect, others that she was living far away and wanted no contact. To most, the story seemed sad but believable. After all, young people ran away all the time. Josef even convinced authorities not to pursue the case further, citing Elisabeth's letter as proof she was safe. In their eyes, the matter was closed. But under the Fritzl home, Elisabeth remained in chains. A father's visits. Josef's visits became a grim routine. He brought food, supplies, and sometimes books or magazines to keep Elisabeth occupied. But he also brought abuse. He reinforced constantly that she was powerless, that nobody cared about her, and that escape was impossible. Elisabeth, however, refused to completely surrender. She endured. She learned to hide her despair, knowing that her only chance of survival was to outlast him. The world above, the darkness below. By the late 1980s, Elisabeth had been underground for more than 5 years. To outsiders, she was gone, erased from the world. To Josef, she was a possession, the fulfillment of his twisted desires. And yet, despite everything, she was still alive. Her resilience would become the thread that carried her through the decades of torment to come. Because Josef Fritzl wasn't finished. He had plans for Elisabeth that went far beyond imprisonment. Soon, the cellar would become more than a prison. It would become a place where new lives were born, where an entire hidden family would exist in darkness. And the outside world still had no idea. Life in captivity. The children of the cellar. The first birth. In August 1988, Elisabeth gave birth to her first surviving child in captivity, a girl named Kirsten. She had no doctor, no midwife, and no hospital. Joseph provided only a towel, disinfectant, and a pair of scissors. Elisabeth, just 22 years old at the time, brought her daughter into the world in a space barely large enough to move. For a young mother, childbirth is already a terrifying and painful experience. But Elisabeth endured hers in total isolation, terrified and alone, with only the man who imprisoned her offering the most basic supplies. Yet she managed. Kirsten survived, and Elisabeth found a new reason to stay alive. Motherhood in the cellar. Becoming a mother in captivity gave Elisabeth a strange mixture of strength and despair. On one hand, her daughter was a symbol of resilience, a human connection in her otherwise desolate existence. On the other, Kirsten's cries and needs added to her fear. How could a baby possibly survive in these conditions? Joseph showed little concern. To him, Kirsten was proof of his absolute control. He extended the cellar slightly, adding another cramped section to give them more room, but the space remained suffocating. There was no sunlight, no fresh air, no toys, only the damp walls and the hum of the cellar's ventilation system. The expanding hidden family. Over the next 17 years, Elisabeth gave birth to 7 children by her father. One baby died shortly after birth. Joseph disposed of the body without ceremony. 6 survived: Kirsten, Stefan, Lisa, Monica, Alexander, and Felix. The conditions of their upbringing were unimaginable. Some children never saw the outside world until 2008. They learned to walk, talk, and play in a dungeon. The only sounds they knew came from each other, Elisabeth's voice, and the television Joseph occasionally brought them. Joseph, 2 families. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Josef Fritzl's crime was his double life. Upstairs, he continued as a husband, father, and neighbor. Downstairs, he ruled as a captor and abuser. To maintain his lies, Joseph created a system. 3 children, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were taken upstairs to live with Rosemary. 3 children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, remained trapped underground with Elisabeth. Joseph explained the sudden appearance of the upstairs children with new forged letters from Elisabeth. The letters claimed she couldn't care for the Bobbies and had left them for her parents. Rosemary, still under Joseph's control, accepted this explanation. The family officially adopted the children, and to outsiders, it seemed like an act of generosity. Nobody questioned why Elisabeth kept abandoning her children. Life for the children below. For the children left underground, life was marked by deprivation. Kirsten and Stefan grew up never knowing sunlight or open air. Felix, born in 2002, would spend his first 6 years entirely underground. Elisabeth did everything she could to give them a sense of normalcy. She taught them to read and write, using old books Joseph provided. They drew pictures, played games in the tiny space, and clung to each other for comfort. But the physical and psychological toll was enormous. The children suffered from malnutrition, developmental delays, and weak immune systems. Their skin was pale, their eyes sensitive to light, and their bodies underdeveloped from years without natural sunlight. The upstairs children. Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, meanwhile, grew up in the outside world. They went to school, had friends, and lived with Rosemary, who raised them as her own. But their lives were also shaped by confusion. They were told that their mother had abandoned them, and though Rosemary cared for them, they could not escape the sense of mystery that surrounded their origins. Joseph's neighbors and relatives admired him for taking in abandoned children. He was praised as a responsible and generous man. No one imagined the horrific truth that he was their grandfather and their father. Elisabeth's struggle. Elisabeth carried an unbearable burden. She was both a captive and a mother, raising children in conditions no human should ever endure. She tried to shield them from the worst of Joseph's cruelty, comforting them during his visits and protecting them whenever she could. But she could not protect them from the reality of their world. They lived in fear of Joseph's footsteps on the stairs, knowing that with each visit came control, intimidation, and abuse. The cellar becomes a world of its own. Over time, the cellar evolved into a twisted household. Joseph expanded it to include additional rooms, including a small bathroom, sleeping quarters, and a kitchen area. To Elisabeth and the children, this became their universe, 4 walls and no sky. Joseph controlled every aspect of their existence. He locked them in with a timed door, dictated when lights went on or off, and restricted food supplies. If Elisabeth displeased him, he punished her by shutting off power or withholding essentials. The children grew up believing this was life. They had no concept of freedom, no idea that a world existed beyond the cellar walls. For them, the basement was reality. The weight of secrets. Joseph's web of lies stretched wider with every year. Authorities occasionally asked questions about Elisabeth, but her forged letters always convinced them she was alive elsewhere. Social workers visited the Fritzl home to check on the abandoned children Joseph had taken in, but they saw nothing amiss. The children seemed healthy enough. Rosemary appeared to care for them, and Joseph maintained his calm, respectable facade. Meanwhile, Elisabeth bore the weight of 2 realities: the family upstairs, living in ignorance, and her own hidden family, trapped in hell. Kirsten and Stefan, shadows of survival. Kirsten, the oldest child underground, grew into a quiet, withdrawn teenager. Having never known freedom, she became Elisabeth's right hand in raising the younger siblings. Stefan, born in 1990, grew tall but fragile. Both struggled with health problems caused by malnutrition and confinement. Yet despite their suffering, they developed resilience. They clung to hope because Elisabeth gave them something Joseph never could: love. She taught them to dream of a world beyond the cellar, even though they had never seen it. The growing pressure. By the early 2000s, Joseph was nearing 70 years old. He had maintained his horrifying secret for nearly 2 decades, but cracks were beginning to show. Elisabeth had been underground for 20 years. The children downstairs were now teenagers, harder to control and more aware of their reality. The lies were harder to sustain, the health problems more obvious, and the weight of the crime heavier than ever. Joseph's double life was reaching a breaking point, and it would take a single medical emergency to finally bring everything crashing down: the breaking point and Elisabeth's escape. Kirsten falls ill. By 2008, Elisabeth had been a prisoner for 24 years. Her oldest daughter, Kirsten, was now 19 years old. Having lived her entire life underground, her health was fragile, and years of malnutrition and lack of sunlight had taken their toll. In April, Kirsten collapsed. She was unconscious, her body weak, and she was suffering from seizures. Elisabeth panicked. For years, she had obeyed Joseph's rules, but now she faced a desperate reality: her daughter needed urgent medical care or she would die. Elisabeth begged Joseph to take Kirsten to a hospital. At first, he refused, terrified that any contact with doctors would expose his secret. But Kirsten's condition worsened so quickly that even Joseph realized he had no choice. Joseph's story for the doctors. On April 19, 2008, Joseph carried Kirsten out of the cellar and drove her to a nearby hospital. To the medical staff, he explained that Kirsten had been dropped off at his doorstep by his long-missing daughter, Elisabeth. He said Elisabeth had joined a cult years ago and had only reappeared to leave her child in his care. The doctors were alarmed not just by Kirsten's condition but by Joseph's story. Kirsten was pale, malnourished, and clearly unwell. Her medical records were non-existent. Something about Joseph's explanation didn't add up. They immediately contacted the police. Suspicion grows. News spread in the Austrian media. A mysterious teenager had been admitted to hospital with no background, no records, and a strange story about a mother who had joined a sect. Investigators began asking questions. Joseph maintained his lie, but his story was shaky. Where was Elisabeth? Why had she abandoned her children for decades? Why did none of the cult details make sense? Meanwhile, Elisabeth was in the cellar, frantic with worry. She didn't know if Kirsten was alive or dead, or whether Joseph's lies would hold. The trap unravels. The hospital appealed directly to the public, asking Elisabeth to come forward and provide information about her daughter's condition. Joseph now faced a crisis. For the first time in 24 years, outside pressure was forcing him to act. On April 26, 2008, he relented. He led Elisabeth and her two younger children, Stefan and Felix, out of the cellar. He told Elisabeth she would need to play along with his story, that she had indeed joined a cult and had only returned now. Elisabeth was terrified, but she agreed. After decades underground, stepping outside was overwhelming. She shielded her children's eyes from the sunlight, something they had never seen before. The reunion at the hospital. At the hospital, Elisabeth was reunited with Kirsten, who was still in a coma. She appeared nervous, controlled, and afraid, but doctors noticed her strange behavior. Joseph remained close by, insisting she stick to his story. But investigators had already begun to doubt him. His explanations contradicted themselves, and the medical evidence didn't align with his claims. Police pressed harder, demanding that Elisabeth speak to them alone. The confession. On April 26, Elisabeth was finally separated from Joseph. In a private interview with police, she broke down. For the first time in 24 years, she revealed the truth. She told them about the cellar, the years of abuse, the children, and the double life her father had forced her to live. Investigators were stunned. The horror of her story was almost beyond comprehension, yet details matched perfectly with what they had already uncovered, and the evidence in the Fritzl home would confirm it all. The police raid. That same night, police raided Josef Fritzl's house. They descended into the cellar, prying open the hidden doors and tunnels. What they found was beyond anything they had imagined. The underground complex stretched 600 square feet, with narrow hallways, hidden rooms, and reinforced doors. They found children's drawings taped to the walls, makeshift beds, and decades-old belongings that proved Elisabeth's captivity. The nightmare was real. Josef Fritzl arrested. Joseph was arrested that night. At first, he denied Elisabeth's accusations. He insisted she had agreed to live underground, that it was a consensual arrangement. But the weight of evidence and Elisabeth's detailed testimony crushed his lies. Within days, he admitted to building the cellar, imprisoning his daughter and fathering her children. Yet he continued to show little remorse, describing his actions as a way to protect Elisabeth from drugs and bad influences. The world, meanwhile, reacted with shock and disgust. The children see the sun. For Elisabeth's children, rescue was both miraculous and terrifying. Kirsten, still in a coma, received urgent medical care. Stefan, 18, and Felix, 5, were taken outside for the first time in their lives. They blinked in the daylight, overwhelmed by the colors, the air, and the sounds they had never experienced before. Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, who had been raised upstairs, now faced the devastating truth about their family. The reunion was bittersweet. They were brothers and sisters, but the trauma of their upbringing created painful divides. Elisabeth's first taste of freedom. After 24 years in the cellar, Elisabeth finally walked free. She was 42 years old, a mother of 7, and a survivor of one of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. Her first steps outside were not just physical, but emotional, a rebirth after decades in darkness. Yet freedom also came with fear. The media swarmed the story, the world clamored for details, and Elisabeth and her children were thrust into a spotlight they had never sought. Austrian shock. The revelation of Josef Fritzl's crimes shook Austria to its core. Neighbors, journalists, and even government officials struggled to understand how such horrors could go unnoticed for so long. How could a man build a dungeon under his house without suspicion? How could a mother vanish for 24 years while police believed forged letters? Questions of responsibility haunted the community. But above all, sympathy poured in for Elisabeth and her children, who had endured what few could even imagine. The beginning of justice. Joseph, once a respected man in his town, now stood exposed as a monster. The law would take its course, but for Elisabeth, the hardest part had only just begun. She was free, but she now had to heal, rebuild her life, and help her children adjust to a world they had never known. The world knew the headline: a father who imprisoned his daughter for 24 years. But the depth of the trauma, the scars etched into Elisabeth's mind and the minds of her children, would take years, perhaps lifetimes, to overcome. And yet her escape marked the start of justice. The basement that had been her prison was no longer hidden. The truth had been dragged into the light. The collapse of Kirsten and Elisabeth returned to light. The spring of 2008 began like so many others inside the cellar beneath Amstetten. For Elisabeth Fritzl and her children, days bled into nights without distinction. The fluorescent lights flickered on and off at Joseph's command. Meals came irregularly, depending on his moods. By then, Elisabeth had spent 24 years underground. Her eldest daughter, Kirsten, was 19 years old, a fragile young woman who had never once stepped into the sun. Kirsten had always been the most curious, the one who devoured the few books Joseph occasionally tossed down into the cellar. She wrote in scraps of paper, sang to herself, and longed for the world above that she had only imagined through Elisabeth's whispered stories. But years of malnutrition, lack of medical care, and the crushing weight of confinement had taken their toll. In April 2008, Kirsten collapsed. Kirsten's mysterious illness. It began with fatigue. She complained of dizziness, of her limbs shaking uncontrollably. Soon, seizures racked her thin frame. Elisabeth did everything she could, cooling her with damp cloths, praying feverishly, comforting the younger children who cried as their sister gasped for breath. But Elisabeth knew this was beyond her. She had delivered Bobbies with her bare hands, improvised medicine from aspirin Joseph sometimes provided, but now she was terrified. Kirsten's condition worsened rapidly. She slipped into unconsciousness. Elisabeth, panicked, begged Joseph. "She will die if you don't help her. Please, she needs a doctor." For decades, Joseph had been the absolute master of the secret world. But now, reality intruded. If Kirsten died underground, her body would need to be disposed of. That would mean questions. Joseph, though stubborn, was pragmatic. He reluctantly agreed to take Kirsten upstairs. A sick girl emerges into the world. On April 19, 2008, for the first time in her life, Kirsten was carried up the cellar stairs. Joseph bundled her unconscious body into his car and drove to the Amstetten hospital. He explained to the doctors that Kirsten was his granddaughter abandoned years ago by her mother, and that he had been raising her. He claimed she had suddenly fallen ill, perhaps from an infection. The doctors, initially focused only on saving the girl's life, admitted her into intensive care. But something about Kirsten puzzled them. Her teeth, her skin, her posture, everything bore the marks of a child who had never lived normally in society. She was pale, underdeveloped, and malnourished. She had no medical history, no school records, no vaccinations. For a 19-year-old, she looked like someone who had grown up in the shadows. The doctors were concerned. They asked Josef to provide background. He offered vague, evasive answers, insisting Elisabeth, the runaway mother, should come forward to explain. The hospital raises alarm. Word of Kirsten's mysterious case spread quickly among the hospital staff. Her unusual condition and Josef's cagey explanations raised red flags. On April 21, the hospital released a public appeal. They begged the mother, Elisabeth, wherever she was, to come forward and provide information to save her daughter's life. For Josef, this was a nightmare. The wall of lies he had built for nearly a quarter century was crumbling. Elisabeth, still locked in the cellar, pleaded with him to let her see her child. At last, Josef faced an impossible choice. Either let Kirsten die without explanation, or risk Elisabeth revealing the truth. Elisabeth's first step into freedom. After 24 years underground, Elisabeth Fritzl was allowed upstairs. The moment was surreal. She emerged blinking into the world, accompanied by two of her sons. Josef instructed her carefully. She was to repeat the story that she had joined a cult years ago, that she had abandoned her children, and now had returned to help her sick daughter. But Elisabeth, gaunt and trembling, knew she couldn't let the lie continue. For 2 days she remained hidden in the hospital, watched over by staff. Josef tried to maintain control, but the doctors and social workers sensed something wasn't right. On April 26, police were alerted. They approached Elisabeth gently, inviting her to speak privately. At first, she repeated the rehearsed story that she had abandoned her children, that Josef had taken them in. But the officers pressed, offering her protection, assuring her she was safe. Then the floodgates opened. Breaking silence, the confession. For hours, Elisabeth spoke, her voice shaking but determined. She told them about the cellar, about the night Josef drugged her and locked her away in 1984, about the 24 years of rape, coercion, and control, about the 7 children she bore in captivity, about the constant fear of punishment, the psychological games Josef played to keep them silent. The police listened in horror. It was almost unimaginable, yet Elisabeth's details were precise, too precise to be fabricated. When she described the layout of the cellar, the trapdoors, the doors with electronic locks, the officers realized they had to act immediately. Josef's arrest. That same evening, as Josef visited the hospital again, police surrounded him. He was calm, eerily composed as they took him into custody. His only words were chilling. "Now the secret will come out." Police rushed to the house in Amstetten. What they found beneath the tidy suburban home would stun the world. The world learns the truth. The cellar door creaked open. Officers descended into the narrow passageway, through a maze of hidden doors Josef had designed to conceal his dungeon. What awaited them was a world frozen in time. The cramped, windowless chambers where Elisabeth and her children had lived, slept, cried, and dreamed for decades. The air was thick, damp, almost unbreathable. Graffiti from the children covered the walls, simple drawings, desperate attempts to mark the passage of time. Beds were crammed together, toys were scattered, an old TV flickered in the corner. It was both a crime scene and a living tomb. The international shockwave. When news broke on April 27, 2008, the world was transfixed. Headlines screamed of the dungeon father in Austria. Journalists descended on Amstetten. The horror of Elisabeth's captivity was compared to dark fairy tales. A woman stolen away, hidden beneath the earth, raising children in a world without sunlight. For Austria, it was a national shame. How could such a crime have gone unnoticed for so long? How could Josef Fritzl, an ordinary-seeming grandfather, have hidden such monstrosity beneath his home? But for Elisabeth and her children, it was the beginning of a fragile freedom. For the first time, they were above ground, breathing fresh air, shielded by police and psychologists. Kirsten, meanwhile, remained in critical condition at the hospital, her life hanging in the balance. but she had become the accidental key that unlocked the cellar doors. Joseph's mask crumbles. In custody, Joseph at first denied the worst. He insisted he had treated Elisabeth and the children well, that he had protected them from the outside world. He spoke as if he had been their savior, not their tormentor. But the evidence was overwhelming. The cellar told its own story. DNA tests confirmed Joseph was the father of Elisabeth's children. Interviews with neighbors, with social workers, with the hospital staff painted a picture of a man who had lived a double life with chilling precision. Joseph finally confessed, not out of remorse but because denial was useless. He admitted to imprisoning Elisabeth, to fathering her children, to constructing the cellar as his private domain of power. Elisabeth's new world. For Elisabeth, stepping outside was both liberation and terror. She had been conditioned to fear the world, told by Joseph that police and outsiders would reject her, that her children would be taken away. Yet, when she looked into the faces of the doctors and officers who listened with compassion, she realized the truth. Joseph's empire of fear was over. Her children, too, faced an overwhelming adjustment. Some had never seen sunlight, never ridden in a car, never spoken to anyone beyond their small underground family. Psychologists would later say their reintegration was one of the greatest challenges in modern trauma recovery. But at least they were free. The arrest, cellar discovery, and Joseph's interrogation. The night of April 26, 2008, would mark the end of a monstrous secret that had lasted nearly a quarter of a century. The drama began quietly, in the sterile hallways of the Amstetten hospital, where 19-year-old Kirsten Fritzl lay in critical condition. Her sudden collapse had drawn Elisabeth, her mother, into the outside world for the first time in 24 years, and it was Elisabeth's whispered confession to police that had set everything into motion. Now authorities moved swiftly. The trap tightens on Josef Fritzl. Josef Fritzl had returned to the hospital that evening, as he always did when he needed to maintain appearances. To the staff, he was a concerned grandfather. To the police, who now watched closely, he was the prime suspect in one of the most disturbing crimes imaginable. As he walked the corridors, his face lined with calm composure, plainclothes officers closed in. When they approached, Joseph offered no resistance. His only words were a resigned murmur. "Now everything will come out." He was escorted into custody. At that moment, a second team of officers moved toward his home on Ibstrasse 40, a quiet street in Amstetten, where neighbors had long considered Joseph nothing more than an eccentric retiree. What they were about to uncover would shock the world. Entering the House of Secrets. The Fritzl home was an ordinary Austrian residence from the outside. Its yellow-painted walls, neat driveway, and tidy garden gave no hint of the darkness below. Police entered through the front door, moving cautiously through the ground floor and basement. Then, with Elisabeth's precise directions in hand, they located the secret passage. At first glance, it looked like a simple storage area, but behind a row of shelves and concealed doors lay a series of heavy, electronically locked metal doors. Joseph had engineered them himself, using his background as an electrical engineer. To outsiders, they were invisible. To Elisabeth and her children, they were the walls of their prison. The officers descended into the dungeon. The discovery of the cellar. The air grew colder, damper, more suffocating with each step. Flashlights illuminated the narrow corridors. The smell of mildew and stale air filled their lungs. They passed through soundproof chambers, one after another, until they reached the main living quarters where Elisabeth and her children had endured their nightmare. What they saw froze them in place. The cramped rooms were barely large enough to contain the life they had been forced to sustain. Mattresses pressed against concrete walls. A small television set flickered in the corner. Old toys, a doll missing an arm, a toy car worn down to its frame, lay scattered on the floor. Crayon drawings and scribbled notes were taped to the walls, desperate attempts by the children to create a world out of nothing. A makeshift kitchen with a hot plate, a tiny bathroom, and a shower cobbled together completed the picture of this underground existence. The ceilings were low, forcing taller officers to crouch. There were no windows, no fresh air, no sunlight. One officer later said, "It was like stepping into a tomb, a living tomb." The team documented everything carefully. This was not only a crime scene, it was evidence of decades of systemic abuse and imprisonment. Joseph's first interrogation. Meanwhile, Josef Fritzl sat in a police station under bright fluorescent lights. For a man who had spent 24 years orchestrating lies, he seemed strangely calm. At first, he repeated the stories he had told his neighbors, the hospital, and even his own wife, Rosemary. He claimed Elisabeth had joined a cult in the 1980s. He said she had returned periodically to leave infants on his doorstep, which he and Rosemary had adopted as their own. He framed himself as a reluctant caretaker, a man forced into fatherhood by his daughter's supposed irresponsibility. But detectives, armed with Elisabeth's testimony, pressed harder. They told Joseph they knew the truth. They had seen the cellar. They had spoken to Elisabeth. They had DNA evidence from Kirsten and the other children. Joseph's mask began to crack. The break in his story. After hours of questioning, Fritzl shifted tactics. Instead of denying everything, he started to rationalize. "Yes," he admitted, "I built the cellar. Yes, I kept Elisabeth there, but I protected her. I gave her food, a home. I never harmed her." It was a grotesque distortion. He described himself as a provider, a savior even, painting the imprisonment as a twisted form of care. When pressed about the rapes and the children, he grew defensive. He insisted the sexual relationship was consensual. Detectives were appalled. But DNA tests removed any doubt. Every child's paternity traced directly back to him. There was no escape from the biological truth. At last, Joseph confessed. He had imprisoned Elisabeth in 1984. He had fathered 7 children with her. 3 lived above ground with Rosemary, whom he convinced they had been abandoned. 3 remained in the cellar with Elisabeth. 1 infant had died in captivity. The full horror was now undeniable. The death of infant Michael. Under questioning, Joseph also revealed a dark secret Elisabeth had already confessed. One of the twins born in 1996, named Michael, had died in the cellar after only a few days. Elisabeth had begged Joseph to take the sick baby to a hospital. Joseph refused. Instead, he stood by as Michael gasped for air, his tiny lungs unable to sustain life. When the child died, Joseph removed the body and burned it in his furnace. This revelation transformed the investigation. It was not only a case of imprisonment and sexual abuse, but also of negligent homicide. Rosemary Fritzl, the wife who knew nothing. While Joseph sat in custody, his wife, Rosemary, faced her own interrogation. For decades, she had lived in the same house, raising 3 of Elisabeth's children without ever questioning where they had come from. Police and the public struggled to believe her ignorance. How could a woman not know her daughter was imprisoned beneath her own home? Yet Rosemary wept as she insisted she had never suspected a thing. Joseph had controlled every corner of the household. He had locked the cellar, explained away the bobbies, and terrorized her into compliance in their marriage. Rosemary would later divorce Joseph, renouncing him entirely. But for many, her role remained controversial, a symbol of how deeply Joseph had manipulated those around him. The world watches in horror. As Austrian police pieced together the evidence, the world's media descended on Amstetten. The story of Elisabeth Fritzl became an international sensation, dominating headlines in Europe, the United States, and beyond. Reporters camped outside the Fritzl home. Photographers captured every angle of the yellow facade, which came to symbolize the hidden rot behind seemingly ordinary suburban walls. The words "House of Horrors" appeared in bold type across newspapers. Austria, a nation that prided itself on safety and community, was thrown into a collective state of shock. Politicians demanded explanations. How had social workers, police, neighbors, and doctors all missed the signs? The children's rescue. As the investigation unfolded, Elisabeth and her children were transferred to a secure, undisclosed location. Doctors and psychologists worked carefully to help them adjust to freedom. The younger children, who had lived their entire lives underground, were especially traumatized. They struggled with sunlight, with open spaces, with simple social interactions. Their world had been no larger than a few concrete rooms. Now, they were thrust into a reality they could barely comprehend. Elisabeth herself oscillated between relief and overwhelming anxiety. She had dreamed of this day for decades, but freedom brought new challenges. Facing the media, protecting her children, and rebuilding a life shattered by Josef's crimes. Josef's changing behavior. In custody, Josef grew more contradictory. At times, he portrayed himself as a victim, claiming he was misunderstood, that his relationship with Elisabeth had been twisted by outsiders. Other times, he boasted of his control, describing how he had engineered the perfect secret. Psychologists who examined him described a man with narcissistic and sociopathic traits. He lacked empathy, sought total domination, and justified even the most grotesque acts as practical or necessary. Yet as the evidence mounted, his confidence waned. He knew a trial was inevitable. He knew Austria and the world would demand justice. The trial. Josef Fritzl faces justice. The year was 2009. Almost a year had passed since the secret dungeon beneath Ibstrasse 40 had been revealed to the world. Elisabeth Fritzl and her children were slowly adjusting to freedom in a secure, undisclosed location, shielded from media attention. Meanwhile, Austria prepared to confront Josef Fritzl in the place where decades of his domination would finally be stripped away: the courtroom. For the first time, the man who had enslaved his daughter for 24 years, fathered 7 children with her, and deceived an entire town would face public judgment. The trial of Josef Fritzl was not just a legal proceeding. It was a moment of reckoning for Austria, for Elisabeth, and for the very idea of justice in the face of unimaginable horror. The indictment. Prosecutors filed a sweeping list of charges against Josef Fritzl. He was accused of murder by neglect of the infant Michael, who had died in the cellar at just a few days old; enslavement of Elisabeth and her children, who had lived in captivity under his complete control; rape, repeated, systematic, over hundreds of instances across 24 years; incest, fathering 7 children with his own daughter; coercion and false imprisonment, trapping Elisabeth in a dungeon with no hope of escape. Each charge carried heavy weight, but it was the murder charge that could determine whether Josef Fritzl would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Security and secrecy. The trial was held in the provincial court of St. Pölten, a city not far from Amstetten. The courthouse was transformed into a fortress. Police patrolled the grounds. Journalists from across the globe crowded the steps. Reporters compared it to the biggest trials of the 20th century, the courtroom drama of the Nuremberg trials, the media frenzy of high-profile murder cases in America. Yet, despite the international attention, the proceedings themselves were shrouded in secrecy. Much of the testimony was closed to the public, in order to protect Elisabeth and her children. Only selected journalists were permitted inside, and they were forbidden from recording or taking photographs during sensitive testimonies. The man in the dock. On March 16, 2009, Josef Fritzl entered the courtroom for the first time. He wore a gray suit and a blue shirt, his thinning hair combed neatly over his balding scalp. He carried a blue folder in front of his face, shielding himself from the cameras. For a man who had thrived on total control, he now appeared small, hunched, diminished. Witnesses described his demeanor as cold, detached. At times, he seemed almost bored, as if the entire trial were a nuisance. Yet behind that mask was a man who understood that the world was now judging him, and that his empire of lies had collapsed. The evidence unfolds. The prosecution laid out its case with meticulous detail. First came the physical evidence. Photographs of the cellar, the electronically locked doors, the cramped chambers where Elisabeth and her children had lived. Then came the DNA results, proving beyond doubt that Josef was the biological father of Elisabeth's 7 children. Forensic experts described the appalling conditions underground: lack of sunlight, poor ventilation, damp air filled with mold spores. Psychologists explained the developmental delays and health issues faced by the children born in captivity. Then came the most haunting evidence: Elisabeth's own testimony. Elisabeth in the courtroom. At first, Elisabeth had not planned to appear in person. Instead, a 11-hour videotape testimony she had recorded for the court was played to the jury. In it, she calmly and courageously recounted the years of abuse, how Josef had drugged her in 1984, locked her in the cellar, and raped her within hours of her imprisonment, how she endured pregnancy after pregnancy without medical assistance, how her children grew up never knowing the outside world. The courtroom fell silent as her voice filled the chamber. Even seasoned prosecutors and judges wept. One juror later admitted he could barely sit through the testimony without shaking. Then, in a dramatic moment that stunned the court, Elisabeth herself entered the courtroom. She wanted Josef to see her, not as his victim, but as a survivor who was no longer under his control. When Josef saw her for the first time since his arrest, his composure broke. His head dropped. For the rest of the trial, his demeanor shifted from arrogance to quiet defeat. Josef's defense. Josef's lawyers attempted a controversial defense. They argued that he was guilty of imprisonment and incest, but not of murder or enslavement. They claimed he had cared for Elisabeth and the children, providing them with food, clothing, even a television. Josef himself echoed this delusion when he took the stand. He admitted his crimes but framed them as misguided acts of love. He claimed he had locked Elisabeth away to protect her from drugs and bad company. He described his actions as the result of a weakness he could not control. The courtroom reacted with disgust. Prosecutors hammered him with questions. Why had he let baby Michael die without medical care? Why had he raped Elisabeth hundreds of times if his intent was protection? Why had he deceived his wife, his neighbors, and the authorities for decades? Josef had no real answers. His empire of rationalizations collapsed under the weight of evidence. The verdict. On March 19, 2009, after just 4 days of trial, the jury delivered its verdict. Josef Fritzl was found guilty on all charges. Guilty of murder by neglect of infant Michael. Guilty of enslavement. Guilty of rape and incest. Guilty of false imprisonment. The sentence: life imprisonment. He would spend the rest of his days in a high-security Austrian prison, with no possibility of release for at least 15 years. Given his age, 73 at the time, it was effectively a death sentence. As the verdict was read, Josef reportedly broke down, weeping for the first time in public. But few in the courtroom saw it as remorse. Instead, it was the final collapse of a man stripped of control, forced at last to face the consequences of his crimes. Elisabeth's triumph. For Elisabeth, the trial was a turning point. After years of silence, secrecy, and submission, she had confronted her father in the most public way possible. By speaking her truth, she had ensured that he would never harm her or her children again. Outside the courtroom, Austrians gathered in quiet solidarity. Candles were lit for Elisabeth and her children. The media, though relentless in its coverage, largely respected her privacy afterward. She and her children disappeared into protective care, where psychologists and therapists helped them rebuild their shattered lives. Austria's shame and the world's reflection. The Fritzl trial forced Austria to confront uncomfortable questions. How could a man commit such crimes in a small town without anyone noticing? Were neighbors truly unaware, or had suspicion been silenced by fear of meddling? Internationally, the case sparked debates about domestic abuse, hidden crimes, and the failures of social systems to detect long-term imprisonment. Experts drew comparisons to other infamous captivity cases. Natasha Kampusch, kidnapped in 1998 and held for 8 years. J.C. Dugard, abducted in California in 1991 and discovered alive in 2009. The Fritzl case, however, stood apart for its sheer scale of horror. A family created in a dungeon, a double life hidden beneath an ordinary suburban home. Joseph's new reality. Today, Josef Fritzl serves his life sentence in Stein prison, one of Austria's toughest facilities. Reports suggest he lives in relative isolation, despised by both inmates and guards. His name has become synonymous with cruelty, incest, and control. In interviews from prison, he has occasionally complained about his treatment, claiming he has been misunderstood. But the world has long since stopped listening. For Elisabeth and her children, justice came not just in Joseph's sentence, but in their chance to finally live freely. Life after the cellar. Elisabeth Fritzl and her children's struggle for freedom. The iron doors of Josef Fritzl's dungeon closed forever in April 2008. But for Elisabeth Fritzl and her 6 surviving children, stepping out of that hidden prison was not the end of their nightmare. It was the beginning of another long, difficult journey. Freedom after nearly a quarter-century underground was not simple. Sunshine, open fields, social interaction, things that most people take for granted, were overwhelming to those who had lived in a cramped, airless basement. The trauma of captivity was woven into every breath, every memory, every fear. The world now turned its gaze on Elisabeth and her children, eager for updates, yet they longed for one thing above all: peace. The safe house. Immediately after their release, Elisabeth and the children were taken to a state-run rehabilitation facility in Amstetten. The location was kept strictly confidential, protected by armed guards and fences. Psychologists, trauma specialists, and social workers were assigned to the family around the clock. The children were divided into 2 groups. The cellar children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, who had never set foot outside until April 2008. The upstairs children, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, who had lived above ground, raised by Joseph and his wife Rosemary under the pretense that Elisabeth had abandoned them. Though biologically siblings, these 2 groups had lived radically different lives. The challenge for therapists was to unite them into a family while addressing the unique scars each carried. First contact with the world. For the cellar children, stepping outside was like landing on another planet. Kirsten, the eldest, was so malnourished and traumatized that she collapsed and was placed in an induced coma for weeks. Doctors later revealed she had screamed uncontrollably when sunlight first touched her face. Stefan, tall but stooped from years in the low-ceilinged cellar, struggled to walk upright. His spine had curved, and his muscles were weak. Felix, the youngest, had been just 5 when freed. For him, the outside world was magical but terrifying. Trees, birds, even the sky were alien. The upstairs children, meanwhile, wrestled with betrayal. For years they had believed Elisabeth was a wayward mother who had abandoned them. Suddenly, they learned she had been locked beneath their feet the entire time, and that Joseph was not just their grandfather, but also their biological father. Elisabeth's role. Despite her own trauma, Elisabeth became the anchor for her children. Therapists described her as remarkably strong, determined to shield them from further harm. She patiently guided the cellar children through their first experiences, touching grass, hearing music outdoors, feeling rain on their skin. She also worked to bridge the gap between the upstairs and downstairs siblings, reminding them that they were united not by Joseph's crimes, but by survival. In private moments, however, Elisabeth wrestled with rage and despair. She had lost her youth, her independence, and her son Michael, who had died in the cellar. Yet she refused to let Joseph's shadow dictate her future. Rebuilding identities. One of the first steps was changing names. To protect their privacy and help them build new lives, Elisabeth and her children were given new identities. Their old names, tied forever to horror, were buried. Even today, their new identities are closely guarded secrets. The family moved into a specially constructed home in an undisclosed Austrian village. The house was designed with security and healing in mind. Soundproof walls, bright open spaces, gardens for the children, and therapy rooms. Neighbors were asked by authorities not to reveal their whereabouts. Those who did recognize them respected their privacy, often going out of their way to shield them from prying journalists. Psychological battles. Freedom did not erase trauma. Each of the children developed unique psychological struggles. Kirsten suffered from anxiety attacks and outbursts of rage. Years of silence and captivity had left her with deep emotional scars. Stefan battled physical disabilities and depression. His body bore the clearest marks of the cellar. Felix, though the youngest, adapted most quickly, but he too struggled with nightmares and attachment issues. The upstairs children, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, experienced guilt, torn between relief that they had lived above ground and sorrow for their siblings' suffering. For Elisabeth, therapy was both painful and liberating.